I just wanted to double check to see if it was going. This is your instructor for Kinesiology 5 through 5. This course is going to be called Recovery and Regeneration. It's going to be a graduate course. The following course is going to be 5 through 6, which is going to be your applied physiology laboratory course. And this section is going to be 8 weeks in length. So the objective for this course will be to compare traditional and conventional views of substrate utilization, mechanisms of fatigue and recovery. So in this course, you'll be able to demonstrate what is acute fatigue versus chronic fatigue in sports performance. So I've added into the syllabus several different research articles, and along your modules, you'll have a number of research papers to go through. One of those papers, which is in this module for the section, will be general adaptation syndrome, right, by Hans Selye. This is one of the most world-renowned general adaptation type things you've heard about in terms of training by Dr. Hans Selye. The other one is from 1986 by Brooks. So I will include the book. However, the book is just going to be a resource. It's not going to be something that you're going to commonly need to refer to, but I really do recommend, if you want to take a look in the library, to look at the actual book. It's Human Bioenergetics and its application. That's the 4th edition, which is the edition I possess. And he wrote a research article in 1986 discussing the lactate shuttle, which discusses VO2 slow component and fast component, that we'll talk more into detail as we go along this courses. And within this module, we're going to touch base on it, but we're going to really dive into it. So the ongoing debate, still going on about lactate causing fatigue. So which the debate itself is going to be something you're going to combat continually through your career, but it's going to be best to know the science behind fatigue and then how to manage that in recovery. So those are our objectives of this course, and our goal to really get you to grasp those concepts and be able to weigh the pros and cons in the science and the literature. So give me an idea first of what is muscle fatigue. Pause the presentation and give yourself a minute to answer this question. Great, you probably realize there are a lot of answers to neuromuscular fatigue. A lot of times we fail to realize there is a scientific answer to it and a scientific concept of fatigue, whether it be neurofatigue, physiological fatigue, or in the medical realm. A lot of times we hear the word fibromyalgia or chronic widespread fatigue. There's going to be some research literature that we're going to bring up that you're going to start to see where these things are, I guess, nuanced and having complications. So those signs of fatigue, there's the science to it, right? And we're going to discuss the science of exercise fatigue. And the reason I want to keep it towards the exercise side is because there's a different concept in the medical fatigue. Neuroscientists would really be somebody to reach out to see what are those issues when we're talking about physiological fatigue versus neurofatigue. And I urge you to still continue learning and pursue a neuroscience course, or in the future we may even have a neuroendocrinology course or sports neuroendocrinology course to really touch more into all these concepts. So fatigue is looked at the inability to maintain a given exercise intensity or the power output. This results in a decrease in work performance. So it could be classified as acute or chronic. We'll discuss acute and chronic, and we'll go more into what are some of the things of adaptations in these. Juan et al. Has a research article that I suggest you read the literature to if you have not done so far, about the differences in the healthcare field of fatigue, which they do describe the issues in medical and how these things are seen versus the issues in performance and fatigue and exercise bouts, right? This is why we have the American College of Sports Medicine discussing exercise as medicine. So we'll touch more into those two as well as we go along. As you can see in our beautiful graphic, it took a while to find this one. So we have an upper motor neuron. The upper motor neuron is where that information comes into the central nervous system. That central nervous system has two different types, sympathetic and parasympathetic, of measures or managements inside of it, as in the human processing, like the processor, to say, am I getting sympathetic dominance or parasympathetic dominance? And when we look at sympathetic dominance, this is where we have an excessive amount of fight or flight mode or chronic stress, I would want to say. But parasympathetic is going to be your rest digest more than anything, or rest really in recovery. And then when we look at that muscle contraction, that is going to be a different motor neuron. So that's called a lower motor neuron. And the way that exits is, because there's a difference between GSE versus GPE, the way that exit is the signal now sends the synapses coming out to say, I'm going to move, where the reaction from pain is coming from that actual neuron to say, hey, I don't actually feel like something's right at this muscle fiber location. And that sends it up as an upper motor neuron. And hopefully that just that way I described it gives you a sense of how you're going to look at an upper motor neuron or leaving an area versus a lower motor neuron, because we'll touch more into that too and how those occur. We look at muscle fibers in a different way too, because there's a muscle synapses. We kind of forget that it's a neuromuscular junction. So there's a neuron attached, and that neuron now, for like acetylcholine receptor, that neuromuscular junction sends these chemical mediators to tell you, as in action potential, there's an action for forming. And then that performing chemical now needs to say, all right, how do I need to open up something else, or open up a T-tubule, or open up a shuttle? And then these lines, these myofilaments, tend to say, as in your sarcomere junction, I'm going to contract, I'm going to shorten. Or I'm going to, if I'm a myosin head or an actin head, I'm going to latch on to one to perform the other contraction like a chain link. And this is where we have each myofilament connected with these little muscle fibers, these neural fibers, as in your connection will get delayed. And then that's the motor unit recruitment. So we have more fatigue if we don't recruit all the fibers, or some are recruited. And you start to notice we don't use as much. So along the way, we'll discuss more of that in terms of fatigue, how you look at a muscle contraction, an exercise, or an injury, right? How that repair occurs. How do we get the muscle fibers to fire efficiently for the injury? We'll talk about the traditional versus functional views of substrate utilization and how these things are measured with the respiratory quotient, as in volume of oxygen and then carbon dioxide. So there's a ratio, you just divide those two numbers and you basically get the way the carbon dioxide is not being dispelled or coming out, and causing that oxygen carrying capacity to limit and shorten. And a muscle ideally needs oxygen to contract. Coyle et al. In 1995 laid this out in detail on how you would be able to measure these things and use them effectively, as in the still today, to predict certain things in fatigue and predict an outcome of a race. As you can see in the military, there's multiple devices that are used even in the military today, where these devices used to be utilized only in high-end performance centers or research physiology labs. So the traditional views of substrate utilization, as in I put 2.0 just to give you an idea, we're just going to go a little bit ahead to give you an idea of how our newer thought process is oxygen uptake kinetics, right? So are we looking at VO2 slow component versus VO2 fast component, and then how we're measuring those to look at shuttles that are being transported across to give you optimal fuel utilization or use, because a type 2 muscle fiber can produce speed in terms of faster contraction. Petit et al., which actually is a professor who used to work at Rocky Mountain, and he actually talked about a 3-minute treadmill protocol being utilized with oxygen uptake kinetics that was valid to measure the same thing as a VO2 test, as an expensive lab test. So we'll look at a lactic component versus a lactic component, and then how these stores are helping to replenish, because lactic acid can be utilized as a fuel source and convert to pyruvate, and then the fuel source can be utilized in a certain amount of time. So this is where we have a resynthesis of PCR stores, phosphocreatine stores, to effectively fuel that muscle. Now, the examples of training along the way would show us that we would train at a baseline, have a workout, and then we'd experience fatigue, and then recovery phase would not come in. So the exercise may be too easy, adequate, or just too hard at a time where it's like, are you doing enough at this phase or too much? This is where we start to talk about um, before we get into super compensation phase, overreaching and overtraining, mainly because there's going to be some overlap between all of these things. And that's why I love this chart itself, because it just shows where the actual connection is between all these. And then we'll be able to see what devices are going to be monitoring these. And are your devices effectively monitoring what your goal is for your athlete? So we look at acute bout. So during the acute adaptation phase, will your device, or let's say if you're going to be in a lab, be able to measure these things? So now we're going to say if you pursue a glucose monitor, are you able to measure glucose output and glucose uptake? Because you'll be able to see if your glucose monitor is sufficient, which I think there's about 2 devices that I want to say in the lab we're going to have for you guys to utilize. Are you able to effectively transfer that information to the athlete and to the coaching staff on why you would purchase it? These are the type of projects you'll be able to develop and put into place where you may work in an environment now, or you're going to pursue a career doing this as a sports scientist or strength conditioning coach. So next we'll look at chronic adaptations. If we're overtraining, are we able to monitor these byproducts, these metabolic byproducts of fatigue and overtraining? As you can see, insulin insensitivity occurs when we have excess amount of like when we say diabetics, utilizing or not burning fat. So are we able to measure insulin sensitivity with our device, with our glucose monitor, or are we able to see it with a glucose tracking device that we just maybe do a prick or something at a lab? Does that give us valid feedback? Is it an indication for overtraining? Are we starting to notice an athlete experiencing a stress reaction or quadriceps strain, and they're not getting efficient muscle glycogen storages for the tissue to repair? So pause the lecture and consider the complications to overtraining and overreaching. Think about it. Are you able to monitor these adaptations in training? So now, if we think about general performance decline, we can see those things with heart rate, or heart rate variability is more efficient way too as well to assess it. We can see those efficiently by wearing a heart rate monitor and tracking those. But what metabolic markers can we and can we not see? Those are things I urge you to consider when you're reading through the literature, because we're going to talk about inflammatory markers, interleukin 6, interleukin 12. We're also going to talk about cytokine C, cytochrome A, which is another one too. And then most metabolic markers that are going to be determined in a lab form of a hospital versus a lab form in the environment you're in, and the expense of those to actually measure those in training. And then how do we look for adaptations, and is our recovery phase implemented at all, right? Are we monitoring recovery phase? What is the device doing? This is where we start to look at what is the device actually measuring? Are we determining a valid and reliable method? Is the device seeking to assess the measures of fatigue that we just discussed in the course? Can we use effective devices to get the same results that may not be seen as highly credible by others? So this is where we start to look at, are we actually needing that expensive device? Most of the time when people want to purchase a device, they really don't have the knowledge about the device, but they pursue the device because of a marketing scheme. We're going to go ahead and decipher through the literature on some of those things. We're going to decipher through the literature on how, and you're going to provide these scholarly sources as you respond back to. We're going to decide on how somebody would pick a cryosauna versus let's say a general sauna that would be used in a LA Fitness or something like that to increase brain-derived neurotrophic factors. Now, what are we decreasing with the cryosauna? What is the benefit of using cold or cryo to repair and recover tissue? Do we need to go into thermogenesis each time for certain devices? Those are the things where we create cellular responses from a device. Same thing for class 4 laser to improve like mitochondria and the healing power. Do we need to create those? We'll demonstrate the device's feasibility for your population. We'll work on those as class assignments and discussions. We'll figure out what do we have in that population. There are certain devices in Olympic Training Center that are used that most people are not utilizing in collegiate settings. Which one is a neuroscience device? So that device is not typically used in colleges, but is used in certain performance centers to stimulate the motor cortex to fire efficiently for motor control and motor learning. So those are things that we're going to talk about and discuss. We're going to give examples of assignments so that you'll be able to get the applicability from the device and prepare for Kines 536 into the advanced applied physiology class, where you'll be able to be in a lab setting, work through some of these things, and really get your blood markers. See, are you measuring stress responses effectively? Compare them to the watches. Compare them to a Fitbit, a Whoop watch, any of those. And hopefully I can stimulate some different train of thought on what you would use and what you're comfortable with. No answers. I'm sorry, not every answer is going to be wrong. So consider that. So for your course assessment goals, during this course, you'll be pushed to seek an understanding of the science behind the proposed treatment. Develop a really good understanding of key metabolic markers for recovery. Even if you want to shorten it to 5 metabolic markers that you're constantly tracking, what you have and what you're capable to do in your environment, your workforce, is how you're going to determine what your project is going to be. As we go through, you'll have money points. You'll be able to have an assignment that will allow you to reflect, and you'll do that after each quiz to reflect on the money points throughout the week from the reading as well as from what we talked about and discussed in the class. It is a lot of reading, so it is very intense, as well as we'll have a lot of video content to delve into some of these things, because you're in an 8-week course, which is going to be paced a little bit faster, so you can have more time in the lab setting for the following course. The quizzes will provide a quantitative analysis more than anything, so it'll allow me to improve the course and how it's delivered. There are no wrong answers again, so don't get discouraged and keep up the good work. All right, thanks. That'll be all, and I hope to see you through the course enjoying it.